All right. All right. We're live, and we're going to talk a little bit about Surah 48, the victory. I think there's about 23 minutes before David Wood and the apostate prophet go online, start streaming. So I have very little time to summarize this chapter. Hi, Inky. But I think it's pretty short. We should at least be able to get through with a basic summary, even if we're not going to delve too deeply into the details. So this is one of the Medinan surahs. So this is a pivotal turning point where Muhammad, the surah itself is basically, the context is the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which allowed for a number of things. One of them was for Muslims within Mecca to worship publicly and to be Muslims and not be subject to repercussions. And it also recognized Muhammad and the Muslims and his followers in Medina. So it was kind of like an official acknowledgement of Muhammad after repeated conflicts between the two parties, the Quraysh and Mecca, who worshipped the traditional gods, and Muhammad, who was creating his own religion that was partially based on pre-existing Arab deities or one deity, but also was adding his own spin to it and basically forcing people to claim that he is the prophet and that they should follow him and believe in him and Allah. So this was an interim peace treaty, but it's not like a normal peace treaty in the sense that this is a perfect example of the way that Muslims approach peace, and it's never a declarative or definitive peace. It's always more along the lines of an armistice used to rebuild and regather forces and rebuild strength until the Muslims are in the superior position, and then they can attack. And they've done this throughout history, from the days of Muhammad to his successors, the first four caliphs, the Rashidun Caliphate, then the Abbasids, and then the Umayyads, and all the way through the Ottoman Empire. This was something that Muslims repeatedly did. And hi, Love and Light. And I'm kind of sleepy too, but hopefully we can finish this video. But this is something that Muslims did repeatedly, all the way from Muhammad through the Ottoman Empire, all the way to today with groups like Hamas or Islamic Jihad. Whenever they propose a treaty with their enemies, in that case Israel, they'll always couch it in these terms. It's simply an armistice, a brief period or a respite until they can gather enough strength to attack again. And you have this endless cycle of attacks and reprisals and phony treaties that don't really resolve anything because they're simply used as an expedient until the Muslims get more power. And it's kind of interesting, in the Wikipedia entry about this, it's really amusing because at the bottom of the Wikipedia entry about this surah, and you can tell most of the Islamic Wikipedia entries, anything having to do with Islam, they were all brigaded, and most of them were edited to a great extent by Muslims, and not just lukewarm Muslims, but real fanatical Salafi or Wahhabi type Muslims who try to twist and distort history. So in the entry for this surah, at the very bottom of the summary, it says something along the lines of, "This is also important." The article about this treaty that the story is about, it says this is also important because it proves that Islam was not spread just through the sword, which is simply not true. The reason that this was written and that the Treaty of Hudaybiyah existed was because Islam was violent. If Islam was not spread through the sword, then the Quraysh would have nothing, wouldn't have even bothered dealing with Muhammad. They just would have expelled him and left him there and waited for him to die. They wouldn't have they wouldn't have bothered even negotiating if Islam were not a coercive religion. So, whichever Muslim apologist edited this Wikipedia entry, again, it's just evidence of how they'll go to any length to distort history and to put a very a a patina of morality on Islamic decision making. So the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, it basically established a relationship between the Quraysh in Mecca and Muhammad in Medina. But again, this was a treaty that Muhammad would end up violating. And contrary to this Wikipedia article, he didn't do this from a position of strength, and he wasn't doing it to be beneficent towards his enemies. He was doing it as a tactical maneuver, as part of a greater overall strategy to subdue his enemies, to buy time until he could attack Mecca again with a much greater force. Oh yeah, I mentioned that. I'm probably going to get off here before 8, even if I don't finish the surah. So that's just the context for this surah, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and it's a Medinan surah, and this is the first real point in history where the Quraysh are dealing with Muhammad as more or less as an equal negotiating partner, and they're allowing it an opportunity to exist both within Mecca and also within Medina. And but it should be viewed as all Muslim peace treaties are viewed, not so much as a peace treaty as an interim, as like an interregnum before a resurgent assault against the non-Muslim state, which in this case would be Muhammad's tribe. And in one, it says, "Surely we have given to you a clear victory, that Allah may forgive your community their past faults, and those to follow, and complete His favor to you and keep you on a right way, and that Allah might help you with a mighty help. He it is who sent down tranquility into the hearts of the believers, that they might have moral faith added to their faith, and Allah's are the hosts of the heavens and the earth, and Allah is knowing, wise." And it continues in this vein, uh, and that he may punish the hypocritical men and hypocritical women, and polytheistic men and polytheistic women, the entertainers of evil thoughts about Allah. On them is the evil turn, and Allah is wroth with them and has cursed them and prepared hell for them. And as I explained in other videos, you can tell that he's talking about two separate groups of people when he says the hypocritical men and hypocritical women, and the polytheistic men and polytheistic women. The latter are, of course, the Quraysh and the Arab pagans who've never accepted Muhammad as a prophet, and never or haven't yet bent the knee to Allah and his prophet. The hypocritical men and hypocritical women are Muslims that Muhammad doesn't like uh, for various reasons, and they're called munafiq, or hypocrites. These are Muslims who disagree with Muhammad or were not reliable in battle, but they're basically Muslims who who Muhammad doesn't like, and he describes them as hypocritical men. So he's not describing one group; he's describing two separate groups of people. The people that he's targeting, the Quraysh in this case, and the other people are these people who are professing Muslims, but really Muhammad doesn't trust. So um, that's a recurring theme throughout the Quran: the idea of hypocrites or munafiq, these people who disappoint Muhammad in some way or criticize or critique his leadership. And Allah's are the hosts of the heavens and the earth, and Allah is mighty wise. Surely we have sent you as a witness and as a bearer of good news and as a warner. And Islam is the opposite of the gospel or uh, uh the evangelion, the good news. Islam is the opposite of this because Islam doesn't really have any good news to offer. The good news is that your sins are forgiven if you put your trust in Jesus's atoning sacrifice and you follow him. In other words, your debt is erased. That's the good news of the cross. There's no good news in Islam because in Islam there's no guarantee that your sin debt will be erased. In fact, you still have to bear your sin, and or you can offload your sin onto Jews or Christians, but you still might go to hell. And in fact, if you're a Muslim, you probably will go to hell. The only exception being if you're a shaheed or a martyr. If you kill yourself in the name of Islam, you may be guaranteed paradise. But short of that, there's no real eternal security, or there's no assurance of salvation. So when he says that Muhammad is a bearer of good news, it's really misleading because the news that Muhammad has is the antithesis of the gospel. He's shackling people with burdens and trying to convince them that they'll have to work their way to their salvation, and even then, they'll probably still go to hell. There's nothing really good about Islam, and there's certainly nothing good about the news that Muhammad is spreading. Uh, but this is what he says is the good news: that you may believe in Allah and His apostle, and may aid him and revere him, and that you may declare His glory morning and evening. So again, he's saying believe in Allah and His apostle. He's equating Muhammad once again with the person uh, that they presume created Muhammad, and he's saying to aid and revere him, and he's including him in the same category. So he's essentially he's he's a co-equal with Allah, even though Muhammad denies this repeatedly. It's affirmed in the Quran whenever you see this phrase "believe in Allah and His apostle." What you're seeing is basically Muhammad deifying himself. And it says in 10, surely those who swear allegiance to you do but swear allegiance to Allah. The hand of Allah is above their hands. Therefore, whoever breaks his faith, he breaks it only to the injury of his own soul. And whoever fulfills what he has covenanted with Allah, he will grant him a mighty reward. And again, he's equating fidelity to Muhammad with fidelity to Allah, and they're basically interchangeable. If you read this verse really closely, he's saying, "Who swear allegiance to you do but swear allegiance to Allah." So, in other words, taking an oath or a bayat to Muhammad is equivalent to taking an oath to obey God. And this is something you would expect if you read the Shahada, which every Muslim is forced to recite the Shahada in order to be a Muslim. It, it's an oath of allegiance to Allah and to Muhammad. You can't recite it without the Muhammad part. Just imagine this. And a good contrast is when you look at Paul, when Paul is upbraiding the church in Corinth, and he says he's trying to reprimand them for what's going on, and they're defiling the Lord's table, and there are divisions, and there are all sorts of really heretical and just just all sorts of nonsense happening there. And one of the things is there are factions within the church that are swearing allegiance to different people. And Paul says one says I am of Apollos, and another says I am of Paul. And Paul explains how ridiculous this is, and he says, did Paul was 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 Paul crucified for you? And his point there is that Paul, his point is that he's simply an apostle of Christ. He's trying to give them the gospel and build them up as believers, and trying to instill all sorts of sound doctrine in this church. He's not someone who is worthy of worship or veneration. In fact, he repeatedly says he says he's the least of the apostles. He says he's the least of the saints. He repeatedly says that he's not someone that's deserving of the honor and glory, that Christ is the one who's the only one who's worthy of glory and honor. And he explains how lives, and this is sort of a model for them to emulate. But he's not trying to get people to worship him, and this is the exact opposite of what Muhammad is doing. Muhammad is trying to establish himself as a co-equal to Allah, who he claims is God. So he's essentially, if you really look at this, even from a Muslim perspective, this seems very blasphemous. If you really do think that Allah is the only God, the true God, why would Allah want you to have someone, a human being, especially a very sinful human being like Muhammad? Why would Allah want you to have him held in the same esteem as Allah himself? It doesn't make any sense. But this is what these verses 9 and 10, they're basically Muslim protestations to the contrary. They're basically saying that Allah and Muhammad are equal, that they're co-equals. Basically, you have Allah, Muhammad, and Jibril as like the Muslim unholy trinity. So in 11 it says, those of the dwellers of the desert who were left behind will say to you, our property and our families kept us busy, so ask forgiveness for us. They say with their tongues, which is not in their hearts, say, then who can control anything for you from Allah if he intends to do you harm or if he intends to do you good? Nay, Allah is aware of what you do. Nay, you rather thought the apostle and the believers would not return to their families ever, and that was made fair seeming to your hearts. hearts, and you thought an evil thought, and you were a people doomed to perish. And again, this is Muhammad trying to instill fear in soldiers that might not have been as responsive as he liked, who might have looked at the larger army and feared dying. Uh, okay, so that's basically about a third of the surah. It's a short surah. I'll finish it the next time, so the rest of you can go over to David's stream, and I'll talk to you later.